The soil told the truth before anyone else did. Nora Callahan learned that from her father when she was 12 years old, standing in the same field on a morning that smelled like coming rain. Gerald had handed her a wooden measuring rod, smooth pale from years of use, and shown her how to push it 30 centimeters into the earth, pull it out slowly, and bring it close to her nose. Dry soil smelled like dish and old paper. Good soil smelled like rain that had already fallen and been absorbed like something alive working quietly underground. He made her practice until she could tell the difference with her eyes closed. On this April morning in 1994, Nora pushed the rod into the earth and pulled it out. She brought it close and breathed in. Ash, old paper, nothing alive. Behind her, a horn sounded from the county road. A white truck was slowing near the gate, its company logo bright in the early light. The buyers from Rapid City. They were 2 hours early. Nora did not turn around. She pushed the rod into a different spot 6 feet to the left, pulled it out, smelled it again. Still ash. She moved to a third spot and did it again. Not because she expected a different answer, but because her father had taught her that the land deserved to be asked more than once before you gave up on it. The horn sounded a second time. She pushed the rod into the earth a fourth time, and when she finally pulled it free and held it up in the pale morning light, she could see the dry crumble of soil clinging to the wood like something already dead. She straightened up and walked back toward the house without looking at the truck. The Mitchell Ranch had once been called Callahan Land for 30 years, before anyone started calling it a ranch at all. 720 acres outside Faith, South Dakota, sitting where the prairie rolled in long, slow waves toward a horizon that looked the same in every direction. Gerald Callahan had worked this land since before Nora was born, and his presence was still everywhere on it, even 3 years after his death. Not in any dramatic way, in the way that mattered more. There was the fence along the northwest corner that he repainted white every spring, a stretch of old cedar posts and wire that nobody could see from the county road that served no particular purpose beyond marking where the property turned. Nora had asked him once why he bothered. He had kept painting without looking up. "Because I know it is there," he said. That was the entire answer. There was the shelf above the kitchen table where he kept his agricultural journals, a stack of them going back 15 years. Each one filled with passages he had underlined in red pen, with question marks written in the margins. Not agreement, questions. He had underlined the things he was not sure about, the things he wanted to argue with, the things he planned to go back and reconsider. Nora had read those underlined passages more carefully than anything she had studied in 4 years at South Dakota State University. And there was the water pump on the east side of the property, the one he had been repairing during a heat wave in the summer of 1991 when his heart gave out without warning. Nora had been the one who found him. She had walked out there in the late afternoon to tell him dinner was ready and found him lying in the tall grass beside the pump with one hand still resting on the wrench. She had not told anyone what that moment felt like. Not Dorothea, not Owen. She had simply carried it alone the way the land carried things, quietly and without ceremony. Inside the farmhouse, Dorothea Callahan sat at the kitchen table with a folder spread open in front of her. At 48, she was still a handsome woman, her dark blonde hair threaded through with silver. Now the lines around her eyes deeper than they had been when Gerald was alive. She had learned to carry fear the way practical people do, pressed down beneath calm and decision rarely visible until the moment it became unavoidable. Nora came through the screen door and saw the folder before she saw anything else. She recognized it immediately. The sale agreement from the company in Rapid City. She had seen the envelope arrive 2 weeks ago and watched her mother carry it inside without a word. What she did not expect was what she found when she crossed the room and looked at the last page. A signature. Faint, pressed hard into the paper by a young hand that had wanted to seem certain. Owen. Nora stood very still. Her younger brother was 19 years old and had been gone for 3 months, first to Rapid City, and then not answering the phone with any regularity. His chair at the breakfast table had been empty that morning, and Dorothea had mentioned only that he had come home the night before. Nora had looked at that empty chair and understood something without being told. She understood it fully now. As the co-heir named in Gerald Callahan's will, Owen had signed the final page of the sale agreement to indicate his intention to sell his share of the property. The signature alone was not enough to complete the transaction. The company needed all parties, but it created something almost as dangerous as a completed sale. It created legal pressure. It created the possibility that if Nora refused and Dorothea refused, Owen could go to a court and petition for the forced division and sale of inherited property, and courts in South Dakota had granted such petitions before. Nora set the folder back on the table with both hands. She did not slam it. She placed it down carefully and stood there looking at it. When Owen came through the door, an hour later, she was still in the kitchen. He looked thinner than she remembered. He had their father's build, broad-shouldered and angular, but the weight had come off him in the months away, and he moved with the particular tension of someone who had been rehearsing a conversation and was not certain the rehearsal had been long enough. He set his bag inside the door and looked at her, and then at the folder on the table. "You knew I would find it," Nora said. Owen pulled out a chair and sat down. "I needed you to find it," he said. "I did not want to hand it to you. That is a distinction without much difference." He looked at his hands. Outside, the white truck from Rapid City was still parked near the gate. Nobody had come to the door yet. "Nora," he said. He said her name the way people say names when they are about to say something they know is going to cause pain and have decided to say it anyway. "Look at her." He nodded toward the hallway where Dorothea had gone when they heard Owen's truck. "She is 50 pounds lighter than she was when Dad died. She does not sleep. She checks the mail like she is afraid of what is in it every single day. I watch her do that." Nora said nothing. "You have a degree," he said. "You have options. If this goes wrong, which it is going to, you can start over somewhere else." "What does she do?" "She is 48 years old and this ranch is everything she has. You are asking her to bet everything she has left on an idea you read in a textbook. The idea is not from a textbook." "Then where is it from?" Nora looked at him. "From the land itself," she said. "If you spent time here instead of in Rapid City, you would have seen it happening already." Owen shook his head. "I am not trying to hurt you. I am trying to protect her." "You are trying to make the fear stop," Nora said. "That is different from protecting her." The room fell into a silence that had weight to it. Dorothea did not come back into the kitchen. They could hear her moving in the hallway, the careful sound of someone choosing not to be in a room where her children were telling each other difficult truths. Before Owen left to go to his room, he stopped at the door and said one more thing without turning around. 3 weeks from now, Harlan Briggs is coming out here. Not for a visit." Nora did not say anything back. Owen had already been to see Harlan. That much was clear. What was not clear was how many other conversations had happened in Rapid City that she did not know about. She sat at the table alone for a long time after he left. The folder was still in front of her. She did not open it again. The next morning, she drove to Faith and walked into the First Prairie Bank before it was fully light. Harlan Briggs was 68 years old and had been running the county's primary agricultural lender for longer than Nora had been alive. He was a square-shouldered man with close-cropped white hair and hands that looked like they had spent time doing physical work before he ended up behind a desk. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had learned that kindness without honesty was a form of cruelty that took longer to reveal itself. He looked at the 12 pages she spread across his desk. She had written them the night before by hand, working at her father's desk from 10 in the evening until past 2 in the morning. A land management plan, a projected timeline, a breakdown of what the property could become, and how long it would realistically take to get there. She had not slept. Her handwriting was small and very precise, the way it got when she was concentrating completely. He read all 12 pages. He read them the way she had hoped he would not, skimming, not looking for a reason to stop, but following the argument from the beginning. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at her across the desk. "The problem," he said, "is that you do not have the assets to back what you are asking me to underwrite. Even if I believed every projection in here, which I want to be honest with you, I have doubts about several of them. Even then, the board would not approve it without security I cannot see." Nora looked at him. "If I can demonstrate increasing land value within 12 months, she said, would you extend the existing note?" He was quiet long enough that she knew the answer was not simply no. She started to stand. He held up one hand. "There is something you need to know," he said. His voice changed slightly. It was still level, but it had a different quality to it, the quality of someone who had decided to say something they were not required to say. "The company that wants to buy this property, they are not planning to run cattle on it." Nora waited. "They are an acquisition arm for a regional development partnership. They have been in conversations with a federal highway contractor for 2 years. If they acquire the Callahan acreage along with two adjacent properties, that parcel becomes large enough to support a staging area for a planned infrastructure corridor. The ranch would be graded flat within 18 months of transfer. Nora sat back down. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Harlan looked out the window at the main street of Faith where the morning light was just reaching the storefronts. "Your father lent me money in 1972, he said, when I was younger and had less than I needed, and every lender with real capital said no to me. He did not do it to have a favor owed. He did it because he believed I was good for it. I was. He never once mentioned it afterward." He looked back at her. "He would not want me to stand here and watch that land get turned into a construction staging area without saying something first." Nora drove back to the ranch with two things she had not had when she left: a small reason to believe that not every door was closed, and a very clear understanding of what was at stake if she failed. This was not about saving a family memory. If she lost, the land itself would be erased. Every fence her father had painted, every pasture he had walked at dawn, every acre he had spent 30 years learning, gone under a grader before she turned 25. She spent 2 days after that visit in a kind of focused silence that the people who knew her well would have recognized as the mood she fell into when she had made a decision and was building the structure around it. She drove to 3 different counties. She made calls from a phone at the Agricultural Extension Office. She wrote numbers in her notebook and crossed them out and wrote different numbers. And then she sold the cattle, not all of them, 70% of the herd. The trailers came on a Thursday morning, and she stood at the gate and watched each group loaded with the particular efficiency of people who did this every day and did not think about it the way she was thinking about it right now. Some of those cattle had been born on this property. Her father had overseen their bloodlines for 2 generations. The dominant bull had a scar on his left shoulder from a fence post incident in 1989, and Gerald had named him Absalom, which Nora had always thought was a strange name for a bull, but had never said so. The night before the trailers came, she went into the barn after dark. Maple was standing in the 3rd stall, a broad-faced Angus cow that Gerald had delivered himself in the spring of 1983, staying up all night in a coal barn because the calf was turned wrong and the vet was 3 hours away. He had named her Maple because she had 4 white patches on her legs that looked if you were a man who paid attention to small things like the shape of maple leaves. Nora sat down in the straw beside her and put her hand flat against the cow's side and felt the slow rhythm of her breathing. She did not cry. She sat there in the dark until the barn smelled like itself, like hay and old wood and animal warmth, until she had let the grief of it settle into something she could carry rather than something that would knock her flat. When the sky outside began to lighten, she stood up, brushed the straw from her jeans, and went inside to make coffee. The trailers came at 7. She watched every one of them leave. Virgil Drummond happened to be driving past on the county road when the last trailer pulled out. He was 55 years old, a broad-chested man with a gray mustache and the kind of permanently weathered skin that came from decades under a prairie sky. He had known Gerald Callahan for 30 years and had respected him in the particular way that competitive men respect someone they consider roughly their equal. He had not yet formed a complete opinion about Gerald's daughter, though the opinion he had so far was not flattering. He slowed his truck as the trailer passed him. Then he looked toward the ranch and saw Nora standing at the gate, and he laughed. Not cruelly, just the easy laugh of a man who already knows how a story ends and finds the confirmation satisfying. He said something to whoever was in the passenger seat and drove on. Nora heard it. She stood there until the truck was gone around the bend. Then she went back inside and picked up the phone and called Warren Nighthorse. Warren Nighthorse was 62 years old and lived on a property in the western part of the state that his family had managed for 4 generations. He was Lakota lean and tall with silver-threaded black hair he wore tied back and a face that the years had mapped with deep lines in a way that made him look not old but permanent, like someone who had been in a place long enough to belong to it rather than the other way around. He had started returning bison to his own land 20 years earlier, not as an experiment, but as a recognition of something he believed the land had been trying to tell people for a long time. He arrived 2 days later with a livestock trailer and 12 American bison. Nora had understood intellectually what bison looked like. She had seen photographs. She had read the biological descriptions. None of that had fully prepared her for the physical fact of them. The animals stepped out of the trailer into the morning light, and the scale of them was different from cattle in a way that was hard to articulate. The dominant bull stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, his dark coat dense and rough, the massive wedge of his head held low and patient. He moved with the particular heaviness of something that had not been shaped by human management over generations, that still carried in its body the original instructions it had been given. Warren stood beside Nora and watched them. "Big animals," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You nervous?" "A little." "Good. People who are not nervous around bison usually end up hurt." The animals paused at the edge of the trailer ramp and lifted their heads into the wind. The lead cow, a large female with a small notch in her left ear, stood still for nearly a full minute. Nora watched her. The cow was doing something with her nose, working through the layers of what was in the air, processing information that no measuring instrument Nora owned could have captured. Then the lead cow took one step forward and another, and she walked in a straight line across the pasture, not wandering, not grazing, moving with clear intention toward the northeast corner of the property. The others followed. Warren was already reaching into the cab of his truck. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out to Nora. When she opened it, she found a hand-drawn map rendered in brown ink on paper that had gone soft with age and handling. It was a Lakota migration map he told her, drawn in the late 19th century, documenting the seasonal movement corridors of bison herds across the Central Plains. He pointed to a line on the map. Then he turned and pointed at the northeast corner of the property where the lead cow had walked and the rest of the herd was now following. This land was on one of the oldest routes, he said. Your northeast quarter was a corridor for thousands of animals for longer than anyone has records for. The soil there has been worked by bison hooves and bison dung and bison wallows for more generations than either of us can count. He folded the map and held it out to her. The land has not forgotten what it was built to do. It only needs to be allowed to remember. Nora took the map. She looked at the herd moving through the brown grass toward the northeast corner, the lead cow still walking with that same unhurried certainty. She thought about what Warren had said. Then she folded the map and put it in her coat pocket, and 3 days later, she tucked it into the top drawer of her father's desk under the agricultural journals with the red underlined passages. She would not need it again for 4 years, but she would know exactly where it was. The reaction from the county was faster than she had expected and louder than she had hoped. Within 2 weeks of the bison's arrival, the story had traveled through every feed store conversation and church parking lot exchange in the county, in the way that stories traveled in places where people had known each other their entire lives and had opinions about everything and enough time to share them. The version that reached most people was not particularly accurate. The version that reached most people was that the Callahan girl had lost her father and then lost her mind, and was now turning a working cattle ranch into some kind of wildlife preserve based on theories she had picked up at a state university from professors who had never raised an animal in their lives. Virgil Drummond's version was the most widely circulated because Virgil was the most entertaining, and because he delivered it at the feed store counter with the relaxed authority of a man who was simply observing facts. She sold off 70% of her cattle to buy 12 buffalo. He told people, drawing out the word buffalo in a way that communicated what he thought about people who insisted on calling them bison. Now she is letting the grass grow up to her shoulders and calling it a land management strategy. Gerald would not have stood for it. The comment about Gerald was the one that found Nora at the auction yard on a morning in April when she was trying to complete paperwork on the last of the sold cattle. Virgil was nearby with 3 other ranchers she had known since childhood, men who had shaken her father's hand at county meetings and eaten at the same tables at community gatherings. They were watching her the way people watch something they are already certain will end badly. She heard the comment. She kept filling out the paperwork. This is how Nora Callahan managed the early months of what everyone in Meade County had already decided was a failure. She got up before dawn. She pulled on her father's old field coat, which still smelled faintly of the particular combination of soil and machine oil that had been his smell, and she walked out into the pastures with her notebook and her father's measuring rod. She recorded soil moisture readings at 17 marked locations across the property, measuring the depth the rod could penetrate, before resistance became too strong, smelling the earth it brought back, writing the number in small, precise columns that she reviewed every Sunday evening at her father's desk. She tracked the movement of the bison herd through the property with the same care mapping, where they grazed and for how long, noting which sections they returned to and which they avoided watching for the patterns that Warren had told her to watch for. Bison, he had explained on the day they arrived, do not graze the same section repeatedly. They move through a landscape intensively and then leave it to recover, which is the opposite of what cattle do when left without intervention. And that difference is the single most important factor in what happens to the soil beneath them over time. She only needed to understand that once. After that, she watched it happen. Rusty moved with her through all of it. He was 11 years old now, a border collie with a black and white coat going gray around his muzzle and eyes that had gone slightly cloudy with age. He had spent the first 8 years of his life following Gerald through these same pastures, sleeping at the foot of Gerald's bed, responding to Gerald's particular whistle from across distances that should have been too great for a dog to hear. When Gerald died, Rusty had walked from room to room for 3 days looking for him with a patience that was almost unbearable to watch. Then he had attached himself to Nora with the same complete commitment as though he had decided she was the next assignment, and he intended to be thorough about it. On the evenings when the pressure of the county's opinion and Owen's legal threat and Harlan's quiet doubt settled into something heavy enough to make it hard to breathe, she would walk out to the northwest fence, the one her father had painted white every spring, for no reason anyone else could see, and she would stand there with Rusty sitting against her leg until the feeling passed. She did not know if she was right. That was the truth she carried through those first weeks in a way she could not share with anyone. She had studied the research. She had read the papers. She had listened to Professor Bennett at South Dakota State talk about native prairie restoration with the quiet certainty of a man describing something he had watched happen rather than theorized about. But the distance between a research paper and the 720 acres of dead ground in a county full of people waiting for you to fail was not a distance that education fully closed. What she had instead of certainty was this: the northwest fence. The red underlined passages in her father's journals. Maple standing in the barn on a cold morning with her breath making small clouds in the air. The lead cow walking toward the northeast corner as though she had been there before, which in every way that mattered, she had. She had these things, and she had one more. On the evening of the third day after the bison arrived, she came back from the northeast pasture where she had been checking water access and found Owen standing in the kitchen doorway. Not alone. There was a man beside him she did not recognize, a man in a button-down shirt carrying a leather folder. A certain kind of leather folder, the kind people carry to meetings where decisions are made. Owen's jaw was set. He had the expression of someone who had committed to something and was past the point of reconsidering it. The man was a lawyer. Owen had hired him to evaluate the legal options available to a CO heir who wished to liquidate their interest in jointly held inherited property. Nora stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her brother and the lawyer and felt the full weight of what was happening. This was not a conversation. This was a formal step. Owen had moved from the argument they had 3 days ago into something procedural and documented something that had consequences that would outlast any single conversation between them. Then Dorothea appeared from the hallway. She came slowly, drying her hands on the dish towel she carried, and she walked past Nora and stood beside her in the doorway facing Owen and the lawyer. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at Owen with the particular expression of a mother who loves her son completely and is about to tell him something he does not want to hear. "You should not be standing there," Owen said. His voice was quiet. He was not angry at his mother. He was afraid for her in the specific way that made him certain this was the right thing to do, and her standing beside Nora was complicating that certainty in a way he had not accounted for. Dorothea looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I have been standing in the wrong place long enough." The lawyer looked at the two women in the doorway. He looked at Owen. He shifted the leather folder from one hand to the other. Owen held his mother's gaze for a long time. Then he looked away. He said something quietly to the lawyer. The lawyer nodded. They walked back to Owen's truck, and the truck reversed down the drive and turned onto the county road, and the red taillights disappeared in the direction of Faith. Nora and Dorothea stood in the doorway until the sound of the engine faded completely. Neither of them spoke for a while. The prairie wind came across the pastures and moved the tall, dry grass in slow waves, and somewhere in the distance, one of the bison made a low sound that carried in the dark. Dorothea went back inside first. Nora stayed. She walked down to the northwest fence, the white one, and she put her hand on the old wood and stood there while Rusty settled in against her boots. The paint had been gone for 2 years. The wood was going gray, but the fence was still straight, still holding its line, still exactly where Gerald had put it and painted it and returned to paint again year after year because he knew it was there even when no one else was looking. Owen would not be gone for long. The legal option was still open. Harlan's deadline had not moved. The company from Rapid City was still parked at the end of a process that ended with her family's land graded flat and paved over. But Dorothea had stepped into the doorway and stood where she stood, and the lead cow had walked without hesitation toward the northeast corner of the property. And the land, when she pushed the measuring rod into the earth in the northeast pasture that afternoon, had smelled not like ash, but like something she could not quite name, something between rain and root, faint and unmistakable like a sentence beginning. In the kitchen, Dorothea sat alone at the table after Nora went outside. She opened the drawer beneath the window. The envelope from the Rapid City Company was inside the extension of their purchase offer, the page that still needed her signature before the option expired. She had kept it for 6 weeks. She had read it 4 times. She had not signed it, and she had not destroyed it. She read it one more time in the quiet kitchen. Then she placed it back in Ross's drawer and pushed the drawer closed and turned off the light above the table. The petition arrived on a Tuesday in July, folded inside an official county envelope, with Everett Strand's name printed in the return address corner. Nora read it standing at the mailbox in the morning heat, Rusty sitting in the truck cab with his head out the window watching her. The document was 3 pages. It had been signed by 4 neighboring property owners, and it cited a county agricultural management ordinance that required grassland properties to maintain vegetation at heights that did not constitute a fire hazard or allow the uncontrolled spread of non-managed plant species onto adjacent land. The petition requested a formal inspection of the Callahan property and asked the county to consider whether corrective action was warranted. She read all 3 pages twice. Then she folded the document along its original creases, put it back in the envelope, and drove to the county agricultural office in Faith. Everett Strand was 34 years old and looked like someone who had been hired to explain things rather than do them. He was tall and narrow-shouldered with sandy hair and thick glasses that he touched with one finger whenever he was working through a problem, pushing them up the bridge of his nose with the absent-minded precision of long habit. He had a soil conservation technician's particular quality of careful attention, the tendency to look at everything twice before speaking, which some people found reassuring and others found aggravating depending on their relationship with patients. He was not hostile when Nora came in. He was something more inconvenient than hostile. He was procedural. "I need to be direct with you," he said, setting the petition on the desk between them. "There are 4 signatures here from adjacent property owners. 2 of them have legitimate standing to raise a vegetation management concern. That means I am required by the county charter to conduct an inspection and file a report within 30 days. I do not have discretion about whether to conduct the inspection. I only have discretion about what I report after I have conducted it." Nora reached into the canvas bag she had carried in and set her notebooks on the desk. Not one notebook. 4 of them spanning 15 months of weekly measurements, 17 monitoring locations, soil readings and grass height records and earthworm counts and rainfall correlation data, written in columns so precise they looked printed rather than handwritten. Everett looked at the notebooks. He did not reach for them immediately. He looked at them the way someone looks at something they were not expecting and are not sure yet whether it changes anything. "These are the measurements from every monitoring location on the property," Nora said. "Every week since April of last year. You can take them with you when you come to inspect. Measure whatever you need to measure, but measure the whole property, not just the sections that are visible from the road." He picked up the first notebook and opened it to a middle page. He read without speaking for a full 2 minutes. Then he looked up at her over the top of his glasses. "You measured earthworm density," he said. "Every monitoring location, every 4 weeks." He turned to another page. He was quiet for another minute. "I will come out on Thursday," he said. "Bring my own equipment." He paused. "I am not coming to confirm what the petition alleges. I am coming to measure what is there." It was not a promise of a favorable result, but it was the closest thing to fairness she had been offered by anyone outside her own property line in 15 months, And she drove home with the windows down and the hot July air coming through the cab and Rusty's ears blown back flat against his head. And she felt something that was not quite hope, but was in the same direction as hope. Everett came on Thursday morning with a truck full of equipment and the kind of focused silence that meant he was taking this seriously. He spent 4 hours on the property. He measured vegetation density at 11 locations. He tested soil compaction at 8 locations. He took water infiltration readings at 3 points along the eastern pasture boundary. He moved through the property methodically, not talking much, making notes in his own spiral-bound pad with a mechanical pencil. Nora walked with him and said almost nothing. She had learned something from her father about the particular usefulness of silence when someone else was forming an opinion. Gerald had understood that talking too much was a way of preventing people from arriving at their own conclusions, and that a conclusion someone arrived at themselves was worth more than any argument you could make for it. At the edge of the northeast pasture, Everett stopped walking. He stood looking at the grass for a long moment. The big bluestem had spread considerably since spring, the tall plants moving in a slow wave in the July heat. They were knee-high in some sections, approaching waist-high in the oldest growth near the northeast corner. Everett pushed his glasses up and wrote something in his notebook. "What are you writing?" Nora asked. He held up one finger. "Not yet." He crossed to where his equipment bag sat in the grass and took out a moisture meter. He inserted the probe into the soil at 3 points along the northeast quadrant, reading the display each time and writing the number down. Then he walked to the fence line and measured 3 points on the adjacent property, which belonged to a rancher named Gus Parrish, who had signed the petition and whose cattle grazed close-cut yellow grass right up to the fence wire. He wrote those numbers down too. Nora watched him compare the columns in his notebook. She watched his expression do something subtle, a small tightening around the eyes that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the expression of a careful man encountering a number that does not fit his prior expectation. He did not say anything about the number that afternoon. He thanked her for her time, loaded his equipment back into the truck, and drove out the gate without telling her what he had found. The report he filed 2 weeks later said the Callahan property was in compliance with all county vegetation management ordinances. No corrective action was recommended. What the report did not say was that in the northeast quadrant of the property, the soil moisture readings he had taken were 18% higher than on the adjacent conventional cattle ranch that had received the same rainfall over the same period. Everett had written that number in his notebook, measured it twice to be certain, and then filed it in a folder he kept in the lower drawer of his desk at home rather than the office. He was not hiding it. He was not certain yet what it meant. He intended to go back and check it again in 6 months and then decide whether it was a data point or an anomaly. The petition went away. But Virgil Drummond's commentary at the feed store did not. He shifted his approach after the county inspection failed to produce the result he had predicted. He was not a man who stopped forming opinions simply because one particular avenue of confirmation had closed. He was a man who had been right about most things for most of his life, and the certainty that came from that record was not something an unfavorable county report could dislodge in 2 weeks. He began asking questions at the feed store counter that were shaped like concern. How is that young Callahan girl getting on out there? Anyone checked on Dorothea lately? 50 head of bison is not a sustainable operation for a property that size. I would think, not for a family carrying that kind of debt load. The questions were not cruel. They were the kind of questions a community asks about someone it has already decided is failing, the kind that sound like care but function as prediction. And because Virgil was respected in the county, because he had 30 years of successful ranching behind him and the easy authority that came with it, people tended to listen when he spoke. They tended to nod. They tended to repeat the questions to their wives and neighbors in a way that gradually built a consensus before the actual outcome had been decided. Owen came back in August. He drove out without calling first and parked in the yard and sat in the truck for a few minutes before coming inside, which Nora took as evidence that he had prepared something to say and was reviewing it one last time. He looked better than he had in April. He had put some weight back on, and the tension in how he moved had settled into something more like deliberate restraint, which was its own kind of tension, but at least it was the quieter kind. He sat at the kitchen table and put a manila envelope on the surface between them. The company in Rapid City has increased their offer, he said. 15% above the original price. They want an answer before the first frost. Nora looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. Owen looked at it too. He said, I am not here to fight with you about this. I am here because I think you deserve to know what the options still are. Mom deserves to know. Nora said, where is she? He glanced toward the hallway. She is in the garden. I did not want to do this in front of her. Why not? Because I did not want her to feel like she was being asked to choose between us again. That was honest enough that Nora did not respond to it immediately. She recognized what he was doing and why, even if she did not agree with it. He was trying to protect their mother from the weight of a decision, which was the same thing she was trying to do by a different method, and the fact that their methods were completely incompatible did not make either of their intentions wrong. I heard you talking to her last spring, Nora said finally. Owen went still. From the hallway. I came in and heard you through the door. She said she knew. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said she should not have to carry this. She has been carrying it her whole life, Nora said. You do not stop carrying things by handing them to someone else. You stop carrying them by setting them down on your own. Owen looked at his hands. Outside through the kitchen window, they could see Dorothea moving between the garden rows with her back to the house, the particular slow, deliberate movement of someone who is working and also listening to everything she cannot hear. I am not asking you to give up, Owen said. I am asking you to consider whether what you are trying to prove is worth what it might cost her. I am not trying to prove anything, Nora said. I am trying to give the land what it needs to come back. Those are different things. Owen left an hour later. The manila envelope stayed on the table. That night, Nora went to her father's desk to write up her weekly monitoring notes. The top drawer was slightly open. She pushed it shut and felt the resistance of something inside catching against the frame. She opened it again and moved the agricultural journals aside, and there at the back of the drawer was the envelope from the Rapid City Company, the original one from 6 months ago, with the extension offer that Dorothea had not signed and had not destroyed. Nora stood very still with her hand on the drawer. She had not known it was there. She had not known her mother had been keeping it. She stood looking at it for a long time, not with anger, with something closer to understanding, the kind that comes when you finally see the full shape of a thing you have been standing too close to read. Dorothea had not fully committed to staying. She had kept the door open quietly the way a practical woman keeps a door open when she is not certain what is on the other side. Not because she did not believe in Nora, because she was 50 years old and she had already lost everything once, and she was not ready to lose it twice. Nora closed the drawer. She did not tell her mother she had seen it. She sat down at the desk and opened her monitoring notebook and worked until midnight. And when she went to bed, she set her alarm for 4:30, 1 hour earlier than usual. If the door was still open, she was going to give her mother a reason to close it herself. The summer of 1995 was hard, and the summer of 1996 was harder. Rainfall across Meade County fell significantly below the 10-year average. In both years, the second drought cycle in less than a decade, and in some ways more punishing than the first, because it arrived when ranchers had already depleted the reserves they had built up in the better years. Hay prices climbed steadily from June onward. By August of 1996, they had nearly doubled from where they had been 18 months earlier, and truckloads were coming in from Nebraska and Minnesota, and one memorable week from as far as Kansas, the drivers looking tired and the prices looking like something printed wrong. The land around Faith turned the color of old paper. The pastures on the Drummond property 4 miles east of the Callahan Ranch had been productive land for 25 years. Virgil had managed them with the confidence of a man who had always been rewarded for doing things the way he had always done them. He used the same grazing rotations his father had used. He kept the grass clipped close and the herd numbers consistent, and the operation efficient in the way that efficiency looks when nothing has gone wrong yet. By July of 1996, half of his southern pastures had stopped producing usable forage. His cattle were moving through stored hay at a rate that threatened his winter supply. He had been to see Harlan Briggs twice in June, both times leaving the bank with less certainty than he had gone in with. On a morning in the second week of July, Nora was working in the northeast pasture when she heard a truck slow on the county road. She looked up. Virgil's truck was parked on the shoulder, its engine idling. Virgil was standing outside it, one arm resting on the roof of the cab, looking at the Callahan property, looking at the grass. The Callahan pastures were not lush. They were not the advertisement for anything she might have wished for. The drought had touched this land too, and the effects were visible. But the big blue stem was holding. The sections where it had taken deepest root were moving in the dry wind, where the neighboring properties had gone still and brown. There was green here that did not exist anywhere else on the county road for the next 3 miles in either direction. Virgil stood there for a long time, not laughing, not saying anything to anyone, just standing there with his arm on the roof of his truck, looking at something he had not expected to see. Nora watched him from across the field and said nothing. She went back to her measurements. 2 weeks later, Dale Morrow came to the auction yard. Dale was 61 years old and had been ranching the same 480 acres south of Faith for 35 years. He was a compact, deliberate man, not the kind who made speeches or went looking for arguments. He had done everything right by every standard the county recognized. He had kept his herd numbers conservative. He had maintained his infrastructure. He had not borrowed beyond what he could service. He had been, in the language of agricultural community gossip, a sound operator. The drought had not consulted his record before arriving. Nora was at the auction yard completing paperwork on a small equipment sale when Dale pulled in. His trailer held 14 head, and when the cattle came off the ramp, she could see from 60 feet away that they were carrying the specific leanness of animals that had been on inadequate forage for an extended period. The ribs not visible but implied. The hip bones a little too prominent. The kind of condition that told the story of a summer before the animal opened its mouth. The bidding opened low and stayed there. Dale stood at the fence with his arms folded and watched it happen with the expressionless attention of a man who had decided that showing what he felt would not change what was occurring. Virgil was standing nearby. He watched Dale's cattle move through the ring and then looked over and saw Nora at the fence and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was a considerably different register than the one he used at the feed store counter, "Looks like it is hitting everybody this year." Dale heard him. He said without turning around, "It is hitting people who have been doing the same thing the same way for 30 years, Virgil. Same as you and me." Virgil had no answer to that. Dale did not look at Nora. He did not need to. The sentence had been directed at Virgil, but it landed in the space between all three of them and stayed there. The cattle sold for 32% below what Dale had projected. He loaded his empty trailer with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a task that had to be completed, started his truck, and drove out of the lot without stopping to talk to anyone. Nora watched him go. She thought about what his land would look like in 10 years if the rainfall pattern continued. She thought about what Gerald would have said about Dale Morrow, which was probably that he was a good man who had made sensible decisions for 3 decades, and that sometimes sensible decisions made in one era become the wrong decisions when the era changes, and that this was not Dale's fault, and it was not something to feel triumphant about. She drove home and went back to work. Adele Rourke appeared on the property in August of 1996, driving a small car with a camera bag in the back seat and a notepad already open on the passenger seat, which Nora took as evidence that she had already been thinking about her questions before she arrived. She was 31 short and quick-moving with auburn hair and a reporter's particular quality of paying very close attention to what people did not say as well as what they said. She had been writing about rural agricultural communities for a regional newspaper group based in Rapid City, covering the kind of stories that larger publications considered too local to bother with, which meant she had spent several years talking to people who were in the middle of things rather than people who were describing them from a distance. She had seen the county inspection report. She had talked to Everett Strand by phone. She had driven past the Callahan property twice before she stopped and knocked on the door. Nora let her in. She spent a full day on the property. She photographed the grass from the road and from inside the field. She photographed the bison from a respectful distance. She walked the northeast pasture with Nora and asked questions about the monitoring data that showed she had read something about grassland ecology before she came. She interviewed Everett Strand in person at the county office and spent 40 minutes with him going through the inspection report. And then she asked to talk to Dorothea alone. They sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Nora could hear the low sound of conversation from the front room where she was pretending to read, but was mostly listening to the tone of voices without being able to make out words. Adele's voice was even and unhurried. Dorothea's was careful at first, the careful voice of a woman who had learned to manage what she gave to strangers. Then it became something else, quieter and more direct. When Adele came out of the kitchen, she thanked Nora and gathered her things and said the piece would run in 2 weeks. She did not say what Dorothea had told her. Nora found out when the paper came. The article ran under the headline, "One Girl 12 Bison in the Last Hope of a Prairie Ranch." It was not the story Nora would have written about herself. It was more uncertain than she would have been, more focused on the question of whether she was right than on the evidence that she was. But it was honest, and it quoted Dorothea, and the quote from Dorothea was the line that people in the county remembered and repeated. Adele had asked her, "Do you have any regrets about letting your daughter do this?" Dorothea had answered, "I have one. I almost signed a paper without asking her first. That is the only thing I regret." The piece circulated through the county and beyond it. Everett Strand read it at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning while Penny, his wife, washed dishes with her back to him. She had been saying for 3 months that she did not understand why he kept going out to the Callahan property on his own time, why he kept the notebook with the 18% number in the drawer at home instead of at the office, why this particular piece of land had become the thing he talked about at dinner when he talked about work. When he finished reading the article, he set it down on the table. Penny said, without turning around, "How much longer?" He considered the question carefully, the way he considered things. He did not have a good answer. The honest answer was that he did not know, and that the not knowing was connected to the fact that the data he was tracking had not yet resolved itself into a conclusion he felt certain about. He was close, but close was not there yet. He said, "I think next spring will tell us something definitive." Penny set down the dish she was washing. She turned around and looked at him with the level directness of a woman who had been patient for a long time and was being patient still, but wanted that fact acknowledged. She did not say anything. She looked at him for a moment and then turned back to the sink. Everett picked up his mechanical pencil and made a note on the corner of the newspaper. Then he folded it and went to put on his boots. 2 weeks after the article ran, Harlan Briggs called a meeting. He sent formal letters to both Dorothea and Nora. The letter said it was a routine review of the property's loan servicing status, which was technically accurate. The way that descriptions of things are technically accurate when they leave out the part that changes the meaning. What Harlan had not mentioned in the letter was that Owen had been in contact with a member of the bank's advisory board, a man named Clifton Reese, who had been on the board for 11 years, and who believed, as a matter of lending philosophy, that agricultural loans extended to family operations that had already been restructured twice were a category of risk that deserved closer scrutiny. Nora and Dorothea arrived at the bank on a Wednesday morning in September. Owen's truck was already in the lot. The conference room held Harlan at the head of the table, Clifton Reese to his right, a junior loan officer with a folder, and Owen, who was sitting with his hands flat on the table in front of him, with the posture of someone who had been in the room long enough to feel certain about his position. Harlan opened the meeting. He reviewed the loan balance. He reviewed the payment history. He reviewed the current assessed value of the property, which had not been updated since 1992 and reflected none of what had occurred on the land in the intervening years. Clifton Reese cleared his throat. He said the board's position is that a property with this payment history and this asset base presents an elevated risk profile that warrants discussion of our exposure. The door opened. Dorothea had not been at the table when the meeting started. She had gone to the restroom before coming in, and the meeting had begun without her, which Harlan had not intended, but also had not stopped. She came in now, closed the door behind her, and sat down in the empty chair beside Nora. She set an envelope on the table. Everyone looked at it. It was a plain white envelope, no markings on the outside. She opened it and took out what was inside and set it on the table where the overhead light could reach it clearly. It was a piece of paper that had been torn into 4 pieces and then placed back together at the edges. Not taped, just held together by being laid flat. Even in pieces, it was readable. The letterhead of the Rapid City Acquisition Company was visible at the top. The signature line at the bottom was blank. Dorothea looked down the table at Owen. She did not raise her voice. She said, "I waited long enough to be certain." Owen looked at the pieces of the paper. He looked at his mother's face. Whatever he had been certain about when he walked into this room, some portion of it became less certain in the following 10 seconds. Clifton Reese looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the torn paper and then at Dorothea, and then made a small sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite acknowledgement, but was somewhere between them. Owen said nothing more. He pushed back his chair and stood up and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out of the conference room. The door did not slam. He closed it quietly, which was almost worse. The meeting concluded without resolution on the bank's position. Harlan said he would need to consult the full board. Clifton Reese said he would take the committee's concerns under advisement. The junior loan officer with the folder wrote things down that nobody asked him to write. Outside the bank of the parking lot, Nora found Everett Strand leaning against his county truck. He had not been at the meeting. He should not have known it was happening. But he was there in the particular way of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to see whether he is going to have an opportunity to act on it. He reached into his jacket and took out a folded sheet of paper. He held it out. It was a photocopy of the page from the notebook he kept at home. The 18% soil moisture differential, the location coordinates, the date, his signature at the bottom. I filed a copy with the county records office this morning, he said. If anyone asks about the current condition of the Callahan property, the official record now includes this. Nora took the paper and looked at it. She looked at him. Why, she said. He pushed his glasses up with one finger. Because the data is the data, he said. It does not matter who benefits from it. It matters that it is in the record. He got into his truck and drove away before she could say anything else. She stood in the parking lot holding the paper while the September wind moved across the main street of Faith and carried a few dry leaves past her boots. Rusty was in the truck, his gray muzzle resting on the door frame watching her with his cloudy eyes. She drove home with the paper on the seat beside her. That night, the phone rang at 10 o'clock. She almost did not answer it. She was at her father's desk with her monitoring notebooks spread open, cross-referencing the moisture readings Everett had given her against her own weekly measurements to see if they told the same story from different angles. They did, which was either confirmation or coincidence, and she was not certain yet which. She picked up the phone on the fourth ring. It was Warren Nighthorse. His voice was calm and even in the way it always was, but there was something underneath the calm that she recognized as significance. He said, I received a letter today from the South Dakota Department of Agriculture. They are asking whether I have any professional relationship with the Callahan Ranch. They included a copy of the newspaper article and a copy of a technical document. Nora already knew what document. He said someone sent them Everett Strand's report, along with a formal request for a conservation assessment. I want you to understand what that means. It means someone in the official record has asked the state to look at your land. And the state, when it looks, will find what you and I both know is there. He paused. He said, do you know who did this? Nora looked at the photocopy on the desk beside her father's journals. The neat columns of Everett's careful handwriting, the 18% written in pencil at the bottom of the column. She said, I think so. Warren said nothing for a moment. Then he said, the spring survey team comes out in May. You should be ready. The line went quiet. Nora set the phone down and looked at the page in front of her, and then looked at the wall above her father's desk, where there was nothing except a nail hole where something used to hang. She thought about Dorothea in the conference room placing the torn paper on the table. She thought about Owen walking out the door. She thought about Dale Morrow loading his empty trailer with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a task that had to be completed. She thought about what Warren had said. The land has not forgotten what it was built to do. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then she began her evening measurements, recording each number in the precise small columns that she had been filling every week for 2 years. Outside, the prairie wind moved across the dark pastures. Somewhere in the northeast quarter, one of the bisons shifted in the grass with a sound that carried all the way to the house. The survey team was coming in May. Whatever the land had been doing underground for 2 years, quietly below the level of what neighbors could see, or what Virgil could dismiss, or what the bank could measure, it was about to be seen. The survey team arrived on a Monday in May of 1998, which was also the morning Nora found that the big bluestem in the northeast pasture had spread another 40 feet beyond the markers she had placed the previous autumn. She was already in the field when the convoy turned off the county road, 3 government vehicles moving in a line toward the gate. She watched them from across the pasture and did not go to meet them immediately. She pushed her measuring rod into the soil at the new growth boundary, pulled it out, and checked the reading from habit. Then she walked back toward the gate with the rod still in her hand, Rusty moving at her heel with the deliberate economy of an old dog conserving what he had left. Dr. Constance Whitfield stepped out of the lead vehicle, and Nora's first impression was of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors and had not romanticized the experience. She was 46, athletic and direct in her movements, with short brown hair threaded through with silver, and the kind of watchful hazel eyes that processed a landscape the way certain people process a room full of strangers cataloging everything before committing to any of it. She had spent years studying degraded grasslands across the Great Plains, which meant she had seen a great many things described as recoveries that turned out to be something more modest when you looked at the data. She shook Nora's hands and said, "I want to be clear about why we are here. We are not here to validate anything. We are here because a formal request for conservation assessment was filed with supporting technical documentation, and that documentation raised questions our office is required to investigate. We measure what is here, and we report what we find." Nora said, "That is all I have ever asked anyone to do." Constance looked at her for a moment. Then she turned to her team and said, "Let us start in the southwest quarter and work northeast." There were four of them besides Constance: a vegetation specialist, a soil scientist, a hydrology technician, and a junior researcher who carried the equipment and took photographs and wrote everything down. They moved through the property with the systematic efficiency of people who had done this kind of assessment many times before setting up instruments, taking samples, recording coordinates, speaking to each other in the clipped shorthand of shared professional language. Nora walked with them and answered questions when asked and said nothing when not asked. Dorothea came out at mid-morning with a thermos of coffee and set it on the tailgate of the government truck without a word, and went back inside, which was a form of hospitality so understated it was almost invisible, and which Constance noticed and filed away. The first day produced nothing dramatic. The vegetation readings in the central and western sections of the property were healthy, but not remarkable, the kind of numbers that supported the county inspection findings without particularly exceeding them. The soil scientist collected cores and labeled them. The hydrology technician ran infiltration tests along the western fence line and wrote the results in her notebook with a neutral expression. That evening, Nora sat at her father's desk and did not open her monitoring notebooks. She sat in the quiet of the room and looked at the wall and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her, and felt like a kind of permission she was giving herself for one night before whatever the next 2 days revealed. The second day changed the register of the assessment. The team moved into the eastern sections of the property in the morning and reached the northeast quarter by early afternoon. The vegetation specialist stopped walking within the first 10 minutes and stood looking at the spread of big blue stem with an expression that Nora had not seen on anyone's face in relation to this land before. Not wonder exactly, something more technical than wonder. The expression of a person who is revising a mental model in real time. The soil scientist dug a core sample at the location where the moisture readings had been highest in Everett's documentation. He cut down 60 centimeters and lifted the sample and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time before he looked at Constance. He said something to her quietly. She came over and looked at the core herself. The topsoil layer was darker than the surrounding sections, dense with organic material, extending deeper than the surrounding samples by a margin that did not fit the timeline of the property's documented history. Areas that had shown severe erosion on the county survey maps from 1991 had rebuilt their topsoil structure to a degree that should have taken considerably longer under normal restoration conditions. The hydrology technician ran her infiltration tests. The rate at which water moved into the soil in the northeast quadrant was 34% above the county average for the current rainfall period, not 18% as Everett had documented in 1996. 34. The land had continued changing after Everett measured it quietly and without announcement, the way it had been doing everything from the beginning. On the morning of the third day, Constance called Nora over to the tailgate where she had spread two maps side by side. One was the county survey from 1991, with its notations of erosion severity and degraded vegetation zones. The other was the map her team had been building across the previous 2 days, marked with the current readings and sample locations. She pointed to the northeast quarter. The difference between the two maps in that section was not subtle. On the 1991 survey, it was marked as severely eroded, low organic content, minimal native species presence. On the current map, it was the most productive section of the entire property, with the deepest soil recovery and the highest concentration of native prairie species returning. Constance said, "I need you to explain something to me. This recovery rate, in this specific location, it does not correspond to what we would expect from even an optimal restoration program or so over 4 years. The soil reconstruction alone should have taken longer." What is different about this corner? Nora reached into her jacket pocket and took out the folded Lakota map. She had carried it there since the night Warren called, knowing this moment was coming, and knowing this was the document that belonged in it. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on the tailgate beside Constance's survey maps. She pointed to the line Warren had shown her 4 years ago. Then she pointed to the northeast corner of the property. This land was a primary bison migration corridor for centuries before European settlement, she said. The soil here was worked by millions of animals over hundreds of years. That history does not disappear. It goes underground and waits. Constance looked at the Lakota map. She looked at her own survey. She looked at the core sample still sitting in its collection tube on the corner of the tailgate. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote something, and Nora could see from the angle that it was not a number. It was a sentence. She did not ask to read it. She did not need to. The survey team left that afternoon. Constance shook Nora's hand at the gate and said the report would be completed within 60 days and submitted to the department. She said it without inflection, the professional neutrality of someone who had not yet decided what the report would say. But she had written a sentence in her notebook that was not a number, and she had done it while looking at a 400-year-old map laid beside a modern soil survey. And Nora had been watching people's faces long enough to know the difference between someone completing a task and someone being surprised by what the task revealed. 3 days after the survey team left, Virgil Drummond came to the ranch. He drove in at 2 in the afternoon and parked in the yard and got out without sitting in the truck, this time without rehearsing at the fence line, without the intermediary distance he had maintained during every previous appearance at this property. He came to the door and knocked, and Nora opened it, and he said, "Can I come in?" They sat at the kitchen table. Dorothea brought coffee and left the room with the same discretion she had shown the survey team, understanding without being told that this was a conversation that needed its own air. Virgil wrapped both hands round his mug and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at Nora and said 3 sentences. "I was wrong. I knew it by last summer, and it took me until now to come say it. That is longer than it should have taken." Nora looked at him. He was 57 years old, and he had been the loudest voice in the county for 2 years, telling anyone who would listen that what she was doing was foolishness, dressed up as education, and he was sitting at her kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug, saying he was wrong, in the particular way of a man who does not say that kind of thing easily and is saying it anyway because he has decided it needs to be said. She thought about all the mornings she had driven into Faith and felt the weight of the community's opinion pressing against her from every direction. She thought about the feed store counter and the auction yard and the petition with 4 signatures. She thought about her father, who had a specific way of responding to moments like this one, a way she had watched enough times to know by heart. She said, "Your south pasture, what does it look like right now?" He exhaled slowly. "Not good. Better than last August, but not good. I converted about 1/3 of it to rotational management over the winter. The other 2/3 are still conventional." "What happened to the third you converted?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It is holding, not dramatically, but it is holding where the other sections are not." Nora nodded. She said, "Then you already know what comes next." He looked at her with something in his expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite embarrassment, and was somewhere between them in the territory that men of his generation occupied when they were acknowledging a debt without wanting to make a ceremony of it. He said, "I would like to talk about what to do with the rest of it when you have time." She said, "Come back on Saturday morning." Before he stood up to leave, he said one more thing. He said it looking at his coffee mug rather than at her, which was his own kind of honesty. "The company from Rapid City pulled their offer 3 months ago," he said. "The highway project got canceled. Environmental impact complications with the routing from what I heard." He looked up. "I thought you should know, in case you did not." Nora went still. She had not known. In the daily work of the past months, in the monitoring and the preparation for the survey team, she had not thought about the Rapid City Company in a long time. The threat they represented had receded the way certain fears recede when you are too busy to maintain them. But she had not known it was gone. Virgil read her expression. He said, "Some things work out without you having to fight them directly. Your father understood that better than most people." He put on his hat and said goodbye to Dorothea in the hallway on his way out. A brief and not unfriendly exchange, and then his truck was reversing down the drive, and the sound of it faded into the open air of the afternoon. Nora sat at the kitchen table alone for a while after he left. The land was safe, not because she had won every argument or proven every point or convinced every person who had doubted her. It was safe because enough time had passed and enough things had happened, and the combination of what she had built on the land and what the world had done on its own had arrived at the same destination by different routes. She was not sure how to feel about that, exactly whether it was satisfying or humbling or both, and she decided eventually that it was both and that both was the honest answer. Owen called that evening. She heard the phone ring and picked it up and heard his voice, and something in her chest registered the particular quality of his silence before he spoke, the kind of silence that means a person has been thinking about a phone call for a long time before making it. He said, "I heard the survey team was there." She said, "They left 3 days ago." He said, "How did it go?" She said, "I think it went well. We will know when the report comes." There was a pause. He said, "I saw the article Adele wrote, the one from last year. I read it a few times." She waited. He said, "I did not handle things right in the way I went about it. I knew what I wanted to protect, but I went about it the wrong way, and I made things harder for you than they needed to be." Nora looked at the wall above her father's desk. She said, "You were scared for her. That is not the same as being wrong about everything." He said, "I was also scared for myself. That is the part I did not want to admit." That honesty sat between them on the phone line for a moment. She said, "Come home for a few days, not to talk about any of this. Just come home." He said he would come the following week. He came on a Wednesday evening and drove in before dinner and parked in the yard and came through the screen door the way he had come through it his entire life. And Dorothea made the specific meal she had always made when her children came home from somewhere, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table and ate together for the first time in 4 years. They did not talk about Owen's legal threat or the bank meeting or the torn envelope on the conference room table. They talked about Maple, who had been sold 2 years ago to a family in Gregory County who sent a Christmas card the first year. They talked about the tractor that had been making a sound since spring that Nora had been putting off investigating. They talked about Gerald's habit of reading the agricultural journals on Friday evenings and arguing with the pages in silence. After dinner, Owen reached into the jacket he had hung on the back of his chair and took out an envelope. He set it on the table between them. Nora looked at it. She did not pick it up. He said, "When I signed that paper in 1994, the company paid me a consultation fee for agreeing to the preliminary intent. I never told either of you about it." He looked at Dorothea and then at Nora. "It was not a large amount, but it was not nothing, and you should have known about it, and I am returning it." Dorothea looked at the envelope and then at her son and said nothing. Nora picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, thinking about what it represented, which was not really money, but a kind of accounting that Owen had decided needed to be settled on his own terms before he could fully come back. She thought about what to do with that. She put the envelope back on the table and pushed it toward him. She said, "Put it toward a plane ticket. Come back for Thanksgiving. And Christmas if you can manage it." Owen looked at the envelope. He looked at his sister. Something in his face shifted in the way things shift when a weight that has been carried for a long time is set down, not dramatically, just a small, almost invisible adjustment of posture that happens when something heavy is no longer there. He picked up the envelope and put it back in his jacket. He stayed for 4 days. The report from Dr. Constance Whitfield arrived in August, addressed to Nora formally, and copied to the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and the Federal Conservation Office in Pierre. It was 14 pages long, and Nora read it at her father's desk on a Tuesday morning with the windows open and the sound of the prairie coming through the screen. The Callahan property had been designated as one of 7 case studies in the department's Prairie Restoration Assessment Program, the only privately owned ranch in the state to receive the designation that year. The report documented the soil recovery rates, the native species, returned the water infiltration improvements, and the resilience of the land during drought conditions that had significantly impaired neighboring properties. It noted the combination of bison reintroduction and cessation of conventional grazing management as the primary restoration mechanism. It described the Northeast Quadrant in a separate section. The recovery rate in that section, the report stated, exceeded documented benchmarks for even optimal restoration conditions and was consistent with land that had maintained biological productivity over an extended historical period prior to conventional agricultural use. The report recommended further study. When the independent appraisal was completed that fall, the property's assessed value had increased by 60% above the figure the Rapid City company had offered 4 years earlier. Harlan Briggs called to tell her before the paperwork arrived, which she appreciated. He said, "I want to say something that I should have said differently a few years ago. When Owen came to the bank, and I did not push back harder on what Clifton Reese was trying to do in that meeting. I should have. And further back than that, I should have done more with the information I had about those buyers." She said, "You told me what you knew, when it mattered." He said, "Your father would have done more." She said, "My father would have forgiven you and moved on. He was not someone who kept accounts." There was a silence on the line. Then Harlan said, "No, he was not." He said goodbye, and she set the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of the house. A week after the appraisal was completed, Constance Whitfield called. She wanted to discuss the possibility of using the Callahan property as the anchor site for a new extension program, a practical training initiative for ranchers in the region who were interested in alternative land management approaches. The program would carry a formal institutional name. Constance said the department wanted to name it after the property or after Nora herself, which was standard for programs anchored to a specific site. Nora said neither. There was a pause. She said, "I want to name it after my father, Gerald Callahan Prairie Foundation." Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought that was the right decision and that the paperwork could be arranged. After she hung up, Nora went outside. It was a September evening, the sky moving toward the particular shade of amber that the prairie produced in the last hour before dark, a color that existed nowhere else. She had ever been a color that had no equivalent in anything built or manufactured or chosen. The bison were in the northeast pasture, the herd moving in that slow, undirected way they always moved at the end of the day, covering ground without urgency. The calves born in the spring staying close to the adults now, but not as close as they had in June. Rusty did not come with her. She had found him that morning at the northwest fence, the white one, the cedar post her father had painted every spring for reasons that only needed to make sense to him. Rusty had walked there on his own sometime before dawn with the last of his strength, and he had lain down in the grass beside the fence post, closest to the corner, where Gerald used to stand with his coffee on Sunday mornings and look out at whatever needed looking at. He was gone when she reached him. His coat was still warm. She sat beside him for a long time with one hand on his side, feeling the absence of what had been there. And she let the grief of it be what it was without trying to name it or contain it or turn it into something more bearable than it actually was. She had covered him with her jacket and gone inside and called no one because there was nothing to call anyone about yet. She would bury him at the fence. Her father would have understood that without being told. Now she walked up to the ridge overlooking the western pasture, where she could see the full sweep of the property in the evening light, the tall grass moving in the slow waves that it had been moving in for 2 years now, the recovered sections indistinguishable from one another from up here, the whole ranch looking from this distance like something that had always been this way. Dorothea was already there. She was standing with her hands in the pockets of her jacket looking out at the same view. She had come up here on her own, which meant she had wanted to be here, which meant something different than it would have meant 4 years ago, when this hillside was a place to avoid because of what the view showed. They stood side by side without speaking for a while. Below them, the bison moved through the amber light. The sky was doing what prairie skies do in September, turning the whole landscape into something that looked like the inside of something warm. Dorothea said, "Your father spent his whole life protecting this land." Nora said, "I know." Dorothea said, "I almost became the person who lost it." Nora turned to look at her mother. She looked at the lines around her eyes and the silver in her hair, and the particular way she held herself now, which was different from how she had held herself the morning Nora came through the screen door and saw the folder on the table. She held herself now like someone who had made a decision she was at peace with, which was a different posture entirely. She said, "No, you became the person who gave it one more chance. That is not the same thing, and it never was." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think he knows?" Nora looked back out at the pasture. She thought about Gerald painting a fence no one could see from the road. She thought about the red pen marks in the agricultural journals, the questions he had asked in the margins of other people's certainties. She thought about a man who had told his daughter to smell the earth before she drew conclusions about it, and who had died beside a water pump in a summer heat wave with his hand still on the wrench. She said, "I think he always knew. I think that is why he kept painting that fence." Dorothea made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was in fact the sound that people make when something painful and something good arrive at the same moment, and there is no separate word for the feeling that results. They stood there until the light was fully gone. The bison moved below them in the dark, the shapes of them just visible. In the last of the evening, the herd spreading across the northeast quarter with the unhurried confidence of animals that knew this ground. 4 calves born that spring moved with the adults, now learning the routes that the lead cow took across the property routes that were not random and had never been random routes that followed something in the land itself that no map fully captured, but that the animals understood through their feet. The big blue stem moved in the night wind. Somewhere along the northwest fence, the ground was quiet. Nora had not invented anything. She had not discovered anything that was not already there. She had stood in a dry field with her father's measuring rod and her father's patience and her own hard, accumulated understanding. And she had asked the land a question that most people had stopped asking, and the land had answered her in the only language it knew, which was slow and quiet, and required you to be paying attention before it would tell you anything at all. She had paid attention for 4 years, one measurement at a time, 1 week at a time, through the laughter and the drought and the legal threats and the bank meetings. In the long evenings at a dead man's desk, she had paid attention to what was happening in the soil beneath her feet, rather than the noise coming from every other direction. And the land had remembered what it was. That was the whole story, not a miracle, not a victory in the way victories were usually told, with a clear winner and a clear loser, and a moment where everything changed at once. This was the other kind of ending, the kind that happened gradually, and then all at once, the kind where you looked up one September evening and realized that what you were standing on was not the same ground you had stood on 4 years ago, and the difference was not luck, and it was not magic, and it was not the product of anything except a particular combination of patience and refusal that some people called stubbornness, and other people, given enough time, called wisdom. Gerald Callahan Prairie Foundation was established the following spring. The first training cohort included 11 ranchers from 4 counties. One of them was Virgil Drummond. Another was a younger man from Gregory County who had heard about the Callahan Ranch from the family who had bought a certain Angus cow named Maple 2 years earlier and had driven 3 hours to attend the first session because he wanted to understand what he had been reading about in the agricultural newsletters. Everett Strand presented the soil data at the opening session, standing at the front of the room with his mechanical pencil and his careful way of speaking, and the 18% figure that had become 34%, that had become the foundation of a 14-page federal report. He pushed his glasses up once before he started, and then did not touch them again for 40 minutes, which Nora had come to understand meant he was certain about what he was saying. Penny Strand sat in the back row. She had asked to come. Everett had not expected that. Warren Nighthorse drove in from western South Dakota and did not present anything. He sat in the front row and listened to all of it, and at the end of the day, he told Nora that Gerald Callahan had been a man worth naming something, after which was the highest form of compliment Warren gave to anyone. And Nora thanked him in the way you thank someone when the thing they have said is true, in a way that exceeds your ability to respond to it adequately. The foundation ran programs every spring and fall for years afterward. The land kept changing. The bison herd grew. Native species that had not been documented on the property in living memory returned in the 3rd and 4th years of the program, birds and insects and grasses that had been absent long enough that some of the older ranchers who attended the sessions did not recognize them at first. Dale Morrow did not come to the foundation sessions. He had sold his property and moved to his daughter's place in Minnesota, and as far as Nora knew, he was doing well enough. She thought about him sometimes when she walked the southern boundary of the Callahan land, where his former property began on the other side of the fence. Different owners now, a younger couple from the eastern part of the state, who were doing things differently than Dale had done them, not because of the foundation specifically, but because the way things were done in the county was beginning to shift in the way that countywide habits shift slowly and then more quickly once enough people have seen a thing work. That was how the prairie had always changed. One root at a time, going deeper than you could see, building something below the surface that looked like nothing from the road until the day it looked like everything. Nora walked the northwest fence on the morning of the foundation's 2nd anniversary and stopped at the corner post where Rusty had lain down 4 years earlier. The grass grew long here now. She crouched down and put her hand flat against the soil and felt the particular temperature of living ground in early spring, cool and dense and faintly giving under the pressure of her palm. She pressed her fingers in and felt the resistance change as she went deeper. Loose organic matter near the surface giving way to something darker and more compact below. She pulled her hand out and brushed the soil from her fingers. It smelled like rain, old rain absorbed and held, and working quietly in the dark the way the land worked when you let it do what it had always known how to do. She stood up and looked out at the northeast quarter where the big blue stem was already showing new growth along the edges of last year's stand, expanding the way it had been expanding every spring, a few feet at a time, patient and unhurried and completely certain of where it was going. She picked up the measuring rod and walked into the field.